Matthew's gaze was enigmatic for an extended period, and I was unable to ascertain its meaning. He stated, "If you ever experience any discomfort, please inform me," before withdrawing his gaze as if to conclude the conversation. I arose, exhaling a profound sigh of relief that the situation had not escalated, and swiftly made my way upstairs. However, I was unable to fall asleep that evening. His words continued to reverberate in my mind. Could he detect something as I did? Is the normalcy I have been striving to preserve merely a thin, fragile veneer that is susceptible to breaking at any moment? In the days that followed, I made every effort to avoid Matthew as much as possible. I arrived home later, departed for work earlier, and spent the majority of my time upstairs rather than in the common areas of the house. However, the more I endeavored to avoid him, the more acutely aware I became of his presence. I could sense his gaze on me each time we encountered one another. Not the gaze of a father-in-law gazing at his daughter-in-law, but a wholly different one. I was left feeling suffocated by a gaze that made me uncomfortable. After a week, the situation appeared to have stabilized. I informed myself that I was likely overthinking the situation. However, on a Saturday morning, Daniel was compelled to depart for an unexpected business excursion, leaving me alone in the house with Matthew. During that period, it was impossible to conceal anything. I experienced fatigue and sluggishness upon awakening that morning. I proceeded to the kitchen to prepare a cup of tea with the intention of retiring for the day. Matthew was already present in the living room when I entered, as was customary. However, this time, his gaze was fixed on me as he closely monitored my every movement. "Layla, are you experiencing any symptoms of illness?" With an air of apprehension, he inquired. I nodded and suppressed a feeble smile. "Indeed, it is merely a mild fever, my father. There is nothing to take seriously." He rose from his seat and proceeded to approach me. "Is there anything you require? I am capable of preparing you a satisfying broth or obtaining the necessary medication for you." I naturally retreated, establishing a buffer zone between us. "No, I am grateful, Father. I am in good health. I believe I will ascend the stairs and take a brief respite." However, Matthew interrupted me with a sentence that I could not have foreseen before I could advance any further. "Layla, I have been unable to stop thinking about you since that day." The room became frozen. I turned to face him, and the expression in his gaze was no longer the one I recognized. It was unique, intense, and disconcerting. I experienced a sensation of the walls surrounding me closing in, squeezing the oxygen from my lungs. I managed to say "Dad" with my voice quivering. He continued, his voice shaky yet filled with determination. "I should not say these things, but I can't hide it anymore." Standing there, uncertain of my response, I was transfixed. I could not have anticipated the extent of this moment. Clear and urgent was the sole thought that raced through my consciousness. It was imperative that I exited this circumstance without delay. The relationship between Matthew and me was forever altered as a result of that moment. The tension between us was unmistakable, despite my efforts to persuade myself that his words that day were merely a fleeting moment of weakness, something he did not truly intend. Whenever we were in the same room, I could sense an unspoken tension that was simmering beneath the surface. It was as if an invisible wall between us was growing taller, yet somehow less stable. I made every effort to preserve a sense of normalcy. I continued to wake up promptly, prepare breakfast, and share it with Daniel before he departed for work each morning. However, my entire body would tense up whenever Matthew entered the kitchen. I was unable to meet his gaze, instead choosing to concentrate on the steaming cup of tea in front of me, as if the increasing warmth could somehow conceal the unease that was enveloping my consciousness. There was seldom much to say from Matthew. He would typically be found sitting peacefully in his chair, sipping his tea, and occasionally flipping through the pages of his newspaper. However, his reticence only served to heighten my anxiety. Occasionally, I would catch his eyes lingering on me when I was unable to escape his gaze in time. I was unable to fully articulate the essence of them, whether it was conflict, anguish, or something more profound that I was hesitant to identify. I came to the realization that I could not continue to avoid him indefinitely as time progressed. I made every effort to escape the situation, including staying out late after work, maintaining a physical distance as much as possible at home, and even attempting to convince Daniel that we should move out and live independently. However, Daniel would only smile and disregard the idea every time I brought it up, insisting that it was unnecessary. He would respond with assurance, "We have been doing well here, have we not? I am concerned about my father's loneliness as he ages." I was unable to counter his argument. Daniel's affection for his father and the significance of their bond were well known to me. As a result, I was unable to disclose even the slightest hint of the weight that was genuinely weighing on me. I found myself alone in the house with Matthew one evening when Daniel was required to stay late at work. The air was heavier than usual, as if the tension that had been percolating beneath the surface for weeks had finally reached a boiling point. I sat in the living room, my attention diverted from the television. The wooden floor echoed with the sound of Matthew's deliberate, steady footfall, causing a tightening sensation in my chest. As I heard him approach, my pulse beat rapidly, each stride serving as a reminder of the pervasive unease that had become an indelible part of my existence. He entered the living room while holding a cup of tea. His eyes flickered with hesitation as he observed me sitting there, and he paused before deciding to approach. "Layla," he said, his voice subdued but resonant with an undeniable gravity. I endeavored to preserve a composed demeanor as I gazed upward. "Yes, father? Is there anything you require?" He seated himself in the chair across from me and placed the teacup on the table. This time, in contrast to his customary behavior, he did not attempt to conceal anything. Rather, he gazed directly into my eyes. His voice was unhurried but firm as he began, "I need to speak with you regarding that day. I am aware that it caused you to feel uneasy, and I experienced the same emotion. However, I require your comprehension of a matter." I forced down a firm swallow, experiencing a sensation of being affixed to the chair all over. "You are not required to provide any additional information, father." I attempted to interrupt him, but he shook his head. "I must clarify this. I will never achieve tranquility if I do not." The tension in the room intensified, and I remained mute, as if a storm were on the brink of erupting. He continued, his voice heaving with regret, "I am uncertain as to when this began, but ever since that day, I have been unable to stop thinking about you. I experience emotions that I should not experience whenever I am in your presence." His words were as keen as a blade, cutting through the air and leaving me breathless. I desired to rise and flee from this location. However, my legs were immobilized and resisted movement. He apologized to Layla, his eyes filled with a desperate appeal. "I am unable to articulate the reason, but I am adamant about not causing you any harm or causing irreparable damage to this family. I simply required your knowledge. You are not at fault for this." I was taken aback by his final remarks. For the first time, I was overcome with an internal conflict that I was unable to resolve as I gazed upon him. Matthew was not merely a man who was entangled in an inappropriate web of emotions. He was an individual who was contending with himself, attempting to suppress emotions that he had never desired. I murmured to my father, "You should not say these things," my voice trembling. "I am your daughter-in-law. This is not even remotely acceptable." His eyes were obscured by agony as he nodded. "I am aware, and I will endeavor to resolve this matter." However, I was unable to conceal the information any longer. I did not wish for you to be the sole bearer of this burden. After standing up, I experienced a sensation of the entire room whirling around me. I stated, my voice more resolute than it had been in weeks, that I could not continue to live in this manner. "I will consult with Daniel, as it is the sole viable alternative. We must relocate." Matthew did not respond. Rather, he lowered his head, as if acknowledging the veracity of my assertions. My heart was weighed down to an unprecedented extent as I exited the chamber. I was aware that this was not solely about my relationship with him. It had the potential to affect the entire family. However, there was no alternative. I was compelled to take this action in order to safeguard everything I held dear. I was unable to fall asleep that evening. I lay in the darkness, listening to the steady rhythm of Daniel's breathing beside me, and contemplated whether he could ever absolve me if he were aware of the full truth. However, I was also aware that I could not endure this anguish for an additional second, regardless of the outcome. After a night of insomnia, I was aware that I could no longer allow the situation to persist. The house, the family, and everything else were gradually descending into a quagmire that neither Matthew nor I should have ever entered. I gazed at Daniel, who was still sound asleep beside me, and his steady breathing filled the tranquil room. He was the individual who cherished me and placed his complete trust in me, and this trust only served to increase the burden on my bosom. I pondered whether he would be able to comprehend and forgive if he were aware of the truth. Or would everything crumble, never to be restored to its former state? I arrived at my conclusion as the draperies parted and the morning sun illuminated the room. In order to safeguard Daniel and this family, I was compelled to depart. Despite the fact that the thought tore at my heart, I was aware that it was the only way to prevent the situation from escalating further out of control. I was compelled to cut this convoluted thread, even if it meant forfeiting a portion of the life I had once cherished. I made an effort to maintain a consistent routine during brunch that morning. As he savored his initial cup of coffee, Daniel inquired about my day's plans as he consistently did. He smiled. I returned the smile and responded with a jocular tone, but I was internally preparing to articulate my thoughts. I awaited Matthew's arrival in the kitchen, and when he did, his gaze momentarily shifted to me before diverting. I was uncertain as to whether he had perceived my resolve. However, I no longer had the option to be concerned. I entered the living room after Daniel had departed for work, where Matthew was found reading the newspaper. I observed that his hands were slightly trembling as they held the paper, but he did not glance up as I approached. I addressed my father with a composed yet authoritative tone. "I require a conversation with you." He placed the newspaper on the ground and gazed at me with an expression of neutrality, despite the fact that I could sense the turmoil that was concealed beneath his composed exterior. "Go ahead," he replied, his voice gruff and low. I stated I have reached a decision in an effort to alleviate my anxiety. "I will consult with Daniel. It is imperative that we relocate. It is the sole method of safeguarding all of us." Matthew's eyes momentarily widened in surprise, but he then nodded as if he had already foreseen this outcome. His tone of voice softened as he stated, "I comprehend. I will not prevent you from doing so if it is necessary. I can only hope that you will be content and that Daniel will be as well." His words caused my trachea to contract with emotion. I was aware that Matthew was not a terrible person in the context of the situation. He was a man of many facets, ensnared in a web of emotions that he had never desired. However, I was unable to allow my sympathy to undermine my resolve. Daniel arrived home that evening, and I was forced to engage in the conversation that I had been dreading. Although I was unable to disclose the entirety of the truth, I clarified that I required a break and that residing with his father had become an overwhelming experience for me. Daniel initially opposed the idea. He failed to comprehend the suddenness of my transformation. However, my resolve rendered him speechless. Ultimately, he concurred. We relocated to a modest accommodation in the city a few weeks later. I was unable to gaze into Matthew's eyes on the day we departed. I was aware that he was observing us from the living room from the window, but I refrained from looking back. It was the sole alternative available to me in order to safeguard the minimal remnants of this family. I endeavored to reconstruct my life as time progressed, with an emphasis on the love we had been able to cultivate and our relationship with Daniel. However, the memories of that house in Matthew's gaze persisted in my subconscious. It was a difficult lesson, one that taught me that closeness and trust can occasionally become double-edged swords if boundaries are not respected. I suffered a significant amount of loss in order to acquire this knowledge. However, I was able to preserve my family, which was of paramount importance. The story's just beginning. There are more broken hearts and dark secrets ahead. Hit like, subscribe, and keep exploring with Love Missteps.